Adrenal Fatigue is a 2-day educational intensive that is designed to look at stress differently. Stress is not only one of the primary drivers of chronic disease, it is negatively impacting the healthcare system as a whole. Today's healthcare providers face unique challenges, working in a broken system with limited time, trying to help patients with chronic stress while not becoming a casualty of stress themselves. This symposium was designed to help clinicians move beyond the current oversimplified view of stress as adrenal fatigue and look at stress physiology in a new way. It also includes practical strategies from clinicians who have successfully transitioned to a functional medicine practice. To make big strides in healthcare, it is critical that we establish a deeper understanding of the stress response system. In this area of flourishing research, and this is why I wanted to talk to Dr. Guilliams today, someone who is at the forefront of what is happening in this field. Thank you for being with us today. I want to jump in right into the topic with these questions. Dr. Guilliams, in your mind, what is the significance of the name of this symposium, Beyond Adrenal Fatigue? What does this mean?
Well, thank you, Lindsay, for this opportunity to talk about this. The idea of stress and health, or health and disease, I think is not anything new, and especially in the last 10 or 15 years, I think there's been a lot of different ways of viewing the idea of stress and dysfunction generally. Unfortunately, the idea of beyond adrenal fatigue, unfortunately, some of this has been, let's say, misidentified, or we've got this idea that it's just the fatigue component and, frankly, just the adrenal component of it. And I think the vast amount of research that's been going into the area of stress, the stress response and stress research is really about the whole impact of stress, the HPA axis, and most of what is being regulated is outside of the adrenal gland. It's actually happening in the brain, in the hypothalamus, in the pituitary, and there's a lot of research looking at what's going on at the cellular level. And when I say cellular level, I'm talking about the modulation of cortisol or glucocorticoid effects on the organism and at the tissue levels. And I think when we sort of simplify it, or maybe oversimplify it, to this notion of adrenal fatigue, we really miss out on really a broad range of research that's been going on in the last several decades, actually, to really help us understand not only what's going on during stress or during stressful situations, what causes stress beyond just this notion that the adrenal gland sort of wears out, which is really not true for the most part. But it also prevents us from really looking at interventions that we can put in place that have an effect on the HPA axis, have an effect at the cellular level that help modulate the effects of cortisol. And most of those aren't per se adrenal support as much as they are really support at other levels that then modulate stress. So I think it's important for clinicians. I think we've sort of gotten the idea that stress affects physiology, stress affects our health, but now I think we really need to tap into the amount of research that's been going on, I think, over the last several decades, and really begin asking more sophisticated questions about how the stress response system affects our health and what we can do about it. And much of that has little to do with adrenal fatigue per se.
That's great. Thank you so much. Dr. Guilliams, why do you think so much emphasis has been put on the idea of adrenal burnout?
Well, I think the idea of adrenal fatigue and burnout, I think when people come in and they say, I'm stressed, if you go to the average person walking down the street and say, are you under stress, they'll almost always link that concept of stress with their energy level and the sense of burnout. And certainly there's been several studies looking at the response of what we call people who are in burnout. Typically that means they're not able to, mount a good response to a stressor. When they wake up in the morning, their cortisol levels are usually a little more flat because their brain is no longer feeling the sense of urgency and driving the HPA axis anymore. So I think there's one of the reasons that idea, both adrenal fatigue and adrenal burnout or burnout in general, is because it's something tangible that people can think about. I'm exhausted, I'm worn down, and obviously there's much more going on usually in those individuals than just what's going on in the adrenal gland or even in the HPA axis for that matter. Might have a lot to do with mitochondria, might have a lot to do with other sorts of burdens on their body. But it's one thing that I think a lot of, just like I said, the person walking down the street can connect between what they perceive as the stress around them. Oftentimes it's work stress or life stress, relationship stress, financial stress, and they immediately sort of get overwhelmed, and that overwhelming feeling is easily translatable into something like fatigue or burnout, even if that's actually not what's happening. But clearly there's a clinical side to that we can define as burnout, but I think that's become very popular because it just seems like people can respond to that idea very quickly.
Great. Hans Selye, the godfather of stress research, helped identify what happens during stress and how broadly it impacts health. We now know that stress directly influences the HPA axis, but what other areas of the body do you see the ripple effect of stress?
So, yeah, I mean, I think most clinicians who have learned about stress and the HPA axis have certainly learned about the discoveries of Hans Selye and all the work that he did, and of course, decades later, we're still, adding on to the things that he and others understood. I think one of the main contributors that I hope is expressed in this two-day conference is that the stress response facilitates the same sorts of activity, actions, metabolic function as under stress as the body needs to do even when we're not under stress. And the way I usually tell people, it's like the same roads that you use to get to work are the same roads that the fire trucks and the ambulances need to use. And so when there's an emergency or a stressful situation, the same signal, the same cells, the same tissues, the same organs need to mount a stress response, but they need to do it in the same manner, using the same cells and the same signals that the body uses on a daily basis just to maintain, our body temperature, our glucose regulation, and all the different aspects that are going on. So when we think of the HPA axis, we always think of it as the stress response, but it also is just the normal way the body regulates things. And unfortunately, because they're using the same highway, as it were, when the fire trucks come and the ambulances come, everyone else needs to get out of the way. And depending on how big of an emergency and how congested the streets are, you might have to be sitting on the side of the road for quite a while. Well, that's sort of one of the ways to think about this idea when we have the chronic need or the continuous need to mount a stress response. A lot of the normal functions in the body get pushed out of the way. They get set aside in order to deal with what the body thinks is an emergency, a stress that potentially is life-threatening or at least perceived to be life-threatening. And so those other functions become dysfunctional oftentimes, or they begin adapting, changing, down-regulating, up-regulating, whatever the differences are. And it essentially affects everything because, glucocorticoids and the effect of the HPA axis is really designed to affect almost every tissue in the body. So I think when we only think of the HPA axis as the stress response, we sometimes forget that it's really the part of our body which is supposed to keep us in normal homeostasis. So that back and forth, I think, needs to be understood. And when we understand that, we can kind of get an idea of why stress affects almost everything. It's sort of like interacting with every part of our body. When we have high amounts of stress, we then shunt various processes in with the body. And in one individual that can maybe expand poor bone health. Other, it can be an advance in neurological disease. Another, it can be advancing their cardiovascular disease. It manifests in different ways in different people because it's affecting all these tissues differently.
Great. And my final question to you, Dr. Guilliams. I know you're doing a lot of research in the area of stress right now. In fact, you're writing a book on this topic. Why are you writing a book on stress, and what are some of the interesting new research areas that you will be covering at this symposium?
Well, the book I'm putting together, it's been something that I've been sort of off and on working on for quite a while. This is a project that I've wanted to get to and finally have been able to focus some time on. Among the things I just said, I think the notion that the HPA axis affects everything, I think there are many different levels within that clinicians haven't been taught and for various reasons don't know about. And for instance, we all know that the hypothalamus triggers the pituitary, which triggers the adrenal gland, and so everybody kind of knows that sort of basic pathophysiology of stress, and then they know that glucocorticoids or cortisol go out to the cells and do their thing. Well, the number of layers of regulation or modulation between the time that a stress comes into our body and something happens in a cell, there's very, very many layers that go on and can be modulated by the body. So I'm going to really be laying out some of those specific things. Many of them are actually something that we can do, modulating with exercise and diet and lifestyle intervention, reducing inflammation, reducing fat mass. All of these things have an effect on how the body perceives stress and how the HPA axis actually triggers cells. And I think some clinicians know part of these things. They know about some of the enzymes that convert cortisol to its inactive component. They know about some of the binding globulins. They know about some of the things going on inside the tissues and cells, but they really haven't thought through it in I think, a very systematic way, nor have they really looked at why certain interventions may be synergistic because they work at these different levels. So what I'm hoping to do with that information, both in the book and at the symposium, is to lay some of that out. The other thing I'm going to focus on at the symposium, and will also be obviously a chapter in the book, is the nuances of testing. There's a lot of testing of adrenal hormones, primarily cortisol and DHEA, or the sulfated form of DHEA, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how we should interpret these. There's a lot of nuances actually in the appropriate way to test this, test adrenal hormones, and the literature and the clinical literature on this is quite a bit different than some of the laboratories and that are being used by some of the clinicians. And so what I'm going to try to do is lay out some of the nuances in understanding how to use laboratory tests and perceived stress questionnaires and other things to really decipher what's going on in the patient based on what's available, what the evidence base suggests they should be looking at. And really, along with all the clinicians that are going to be at this symposium, we're hoping to take that data and then the clinical aspects that are going to be spoken about and really help the attendees really understand the ways that they can really affect the patient that's coming in with most likely some sort of HPA axis dysfunction affecting some part of their physiology.
Well, this is going to be an incredible symposium. I'd like to thank Dr. Guilliams for sharing his insight on the impacts of stress. We hope to see you April 17th and the 18th in Atlanta, Georgia, to continue this conversation with our expert faculty, Dr. Tom Guilliams, Dr. Andrew Heyman, Dr. Jill Carnahan, Dr. Shilpa Saxena, and Dr. Kelly Brogan. Please call 561-997-0112 to register and visit www.a4m.com.